My name is Ann. I'm going to talk about a privacy-preserving yet accountable ride-hailing service. We named the solution ORide, which is short name for Oblivious Ride. The work was done under the supervision of my PhD advisor at EPFL, Jean-Pierre Hubaux. So as you might already know, ride-hailing services such as Uber, Lyft, and DiDi have been increasingly popular. Over the course of several years, they have had millions of users with millions of rides in hundreds of the cities. And this rapid market expansion is because of advantages ride-hailing services have had compared to traditional taxi service, including more convenience, usability, and accountability. But unfortunately, to offer such services, ride-hailing service providers collect a vast amount of sensitive information that puts at risk the privacy of the riders and the drivers, as evidences have been reported. So intuitively, the privacy problems for the riders come from the fact that the service provider collects detailed information about the rides of the riders, including the detailed location trace and the identities of the riders. And as a result, the service provider or any entity who has access to this data can infer sensitive information about activities of the riders. For example, going shopping, clubbing, going to certain clinics, or even one-night stands. But not so intuitive is the privacy problems for the drivers, because their locations are driven by requests from the riders. But in fact, they have privacy problems as well. It has been reported that the service providers track the locations of drivers, and they penalize those who attend taxi protests. The service provider can also discriminate the drivers. For example, they can track and build up profiles of drivers who are working for multiple service providers, and they prioritize sending requests to those drivers with the hope of getting them back to the service. So in this talk, I'm going to present to you ORide, which aims to guarantee strong privacy for riders and drivers. And at the same time, we want to provide equivalent usability and accountability as in the current ride-hailing service. So to do so, we assume a system consisting of three entities: the riders, drivers, and the service provider. The riders and the drivers are active adversaries who might want to physically harm each other, or they want to lie about their reputation scores, for example. The service provider is honest but curious, and it wants to provide riders and drivers activities. The service provider refrains from doing active attacks, such as giving riders and drivers with malicious applications, because the threat of public exposure and reputation loss is already a strong economic deterrent against such attacks by the service provider. So to be more specific, we focus on the following attacks in our work. The first one is that the riders and the drivers might want to physically attack each other. The service provider wants to do large-scale inference to infer sensitive activities of the riders and drivers, assuming it knows the riders and drivers' home and work addresses. In the extreme case, a powerful service provider might want to do targeted attacks on specific riders. What I mean is that the service provider could know the precise pickup location and time of a ride taken by a specific rider, and it wants to know the drop-off location of the ride. In parallel with the privacy goal, we want to have the following usability and accountability features in our solution. We want the riders and the drivers to be accountable for their behaviors. What I mean is that the service provider or a law enforcement agency should be able to identify misbehaving users, even in the extreme case of kidnapping. We want to preserve the convenience and usability of the current ride-hailing service, including easy payment, reputation rating on the scale from 1 to 5, and retrieval of lost items. So the high-level overview of the solution is as follows. At registration time, each rider and driver is issued a certificate by the service provider. In addition, every day, the riders and the drivers obtain anonymous credentials from the service provider. By using the anonymous credentials to log into the service when making ride requests and ride offers, the riders and the drivers stay anonymous with respect to the service provider. But as you know, hiding the identities of the users is not enough to protect their privacy in location-based services, because the service provider might still be able to de-anonymize the users based on their reported locations. And therefore, the rider and the driver should not disclose their locations to the service provider at all. In other words, the service provider has to match the riders and the drivers in an oblivious way without learning their locations. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is how to hold the riders and the drivers accountable for their behaviors, because they might want to take advantage of their anonymity to misbehave. And the third challenge is how to support the payment and the reputation rating operations without breaking the anonymity of the anonymous ride. So in this talk, I'm gonna walk you through the solutions for all of these operations. And let me start off with the Oblivious Ride matching algorithm. The general idea is that instead of reporting the real locations to the service provider, the riders and the drivers provide the service provider with ciphertext locations on which the service provider can do computations and returns the output to the riders. From the output, the rider learns the distance between himself and all the responded drivers, and he can select the one who is the closest to him. So more detail about the ride matching algorithm is as follows. The drivers frequently send the zone of their location to the service provider. So a zone is a geographical area that is defined by the service provider. I'm going to explain later on in my talk how big a zone can be. When a rider wants to make a request, he generates an ephemeral public-private key pair. He uses the public key to encrypt his coordinates, and he sends to the service provider a message consisting of the zone of his pickup locations, his ciphertext coordinates, and the public key. The service provider forwards the public key to all the drivers who are available in the zone, and in return, it receives the ciphertext coordinates of those drivers. Based on the ciphertext coordinates, the service provider computes the ciphertext square equivalent distance between the rider and all the responded drivers. And then it sends the ciphertext distance to the rider, who is going to use the corresponding private key to decrypt the ciphertext. And from the plaintext distance, the rider selects the driver who is the closest to him and notifies the service provider about his selection. So in order to enable the service provider to compute the ciphertext square equivalent distance from the ciphertext coordinates, we use the FV somewhat-homomorphic encryption scheme, which is based on polynomial ring. In this encryption system, the plaintext, the ciphertext, and the keys are elements of polynomial quotient ring with the modulus polynomial of degree d. So we use it as follows. Before encrypting their coordinates with a public key, the rider and the driver represent their coordinates as polynomials of degree d with only one non-zero coefficient at degree 0. When the ciphertext arrives at the service provider, for each of the driver, the service provider subtracts the ciphertext of his x-coordinate with that of the rider to obtain the subtraction of the x-coordinate, and then the square of this subtraction. This square is then summed with the square of the y-coordinate subtraction to obtain the ciphertext square equivalent distance between the rider and the driver. This operation is repeated n times, with n is the number of drivers who responded to the request. So what I explained to you is simple and straightforward, but it is unfortunately unpractical because of the bandwidth and the computation overhead introduced to the rider and the service provider due to the high ciphertext expansion of the FV somewhat-homomorphic encryption scheme. And therefore, we propose an optimization that takes advantage of the polynomial structure of somewhat-homomorphic encryption scheme to enable the service provider to patch ciphertext coordinates from all the drivers in a single ciphertext, hence being able to compute the ciphertext square equivalent distance between the rider and all the drivers in a single operation and return only one ciphertext distance to the rider. When the rider decrypts this ciphertext, he learns the distance between himself and all the drivers by looking at all the coefficients of the plaintext polynomial. In this plaintext polynomial, the coefficient I will contain the distance, the square equivalent distance between the rider and the driver I. We were able to do so by using a nice trick of ciphertext spiking and number theoretic transform processing on the input before encryption. So I don't have time to elaborate on the encryption here, but I would like to encourage you to read that in the paper. So with this, I conclude my presentation about the somewhat homomorphic I conclude my presentation about the Oblivious Ride matching algorithm. But then there are still problems that need to be solved. The first question that you might ask is that, then how the rider and the driver can share their locations with each other so that they can meet and begin the ride? The second question is how to provide accountability in a system where both the rider and the driver are anonymous. There are possible misbehaviors. For example, the rider and the driver might want to attack each other. The rider might want to not pay for the ride, or the rider and the driver could have disputes on the fare. So I will answer the two questions by explaining to you the rest of the ride setup protocol. So after being matched together, the riders and the driver establish a secure channel through which they exchange their reputation scores, their locations, their certificates, and they together generate a pairing pin that is used down in the protocol. When the driver is driving to the pickup location, she sends her locations to the rider through the secure channel in real time. And when the rider and the driver is in the proximity of the rider and the driver perform a proximity check by using short-range communication channels, such as Bluetooth or Wi-Fi direct, so that the driver can verify the physical presence of the rider before she releases her personally identifying information, including the plate number of the car and her profile photo. And this helps to prevent the problem of harvesting attacks on the driver's personally identifying information. And also, through the short-range communication channel, the rider and the driver can verify the integrity of the secure channel. After that, the rider and the driver agree on the fare of the ride, and they together sign the fare report consisting of information about the fare, the day, and the certificates of the rider and the driver. After that, the ride begins. The beginning and the finishing events of the ride are not reported to the service provider. So with this design, accountability is naturally provided. By exchanging the certificate and the fare report with each other, if one party is attacked by the other, the affected party can report the certificate of the attacker to the service provider to identify the attacker. The rider and the driver can also share the certificate and the fare report with their trusted peers in order to enable a law enforcement agency to do investigation in case someone is gone missing, for example, in the case of kidnapping. To make them feel safer, the rider and the driver can also share the location trace with their trusted peers as well. And the service provider can also incentivize the riders to share with the service provider their anonymous location trace, for example, by giving them coupons or like discount. So with the fare report, the payment and the reputation rating operations are fairly simple. At the end of the day, the driver deposits the fare report to the service provider. The service provider charges the riders, as in the current ride-hailing service, from his registered payment method. And once there is a payment record in the system, the rider and the driver can rate for the reputation of each other on the scale from 1 to 5, as in the current ride-hailing service. So with this, I'm done with walking you through the design of the system. And let me give you some intuitions about where the privacy of the system comes from. And to do so, we need to know what's the information observed by the service provider. So from the anonymous ride request, the service provider knows the zone of the pickup locations, and it knows our scheduled pickup time. From the deposit of the fare report, the service provider learns the rider's ID, the driver's ID, the fare, and the day of the ride. In the extreme case, a powerful service provider could know the precise pickup location and time of a ride taken by a specific rider, and it wants to know the drop-off location of the ride. But this attack is prevented because the drop-off locations and times are never reported to the service provider. In a more general case, the service provider knows the home and work address of the riders. And it wants to do large-scale inference to infer sensitive activities of the riders. And to do so, the service provider has to know the riders' IDs, and it has to know the locations and times associated with the rides of the riders. And for this, we did an evaluation for the lower bound anonymity set due to the lack of data set about geographic distribution of ride-hailing users. What I mean by the lower bound is that we assume that the service provider knows the zone where the riders took the ride, and it wants to know the time of that ride. In such a case, the anonymity set is the number of rides coming from the same zone on the same day. So in order to evaluate our solutions, we use a data set of taxi rides in New York City, and from which we extracted ride records for the month of October 2013, and it resulted in 15 million ride records. So the data set contains So the data set contains information about the pickup and the drop-off locations and times. It also provides some information about the drivers. It also provides a mapping between a location point to center tracts and neighborhood tabulation areas in New York City. So a center tract is a statistical subdivision of the county, and a neighborhood tabulation area is an aggregation of several center tracts. So the main goal of our evaluation is to see how practical and efficient is ORide. And in order to do so, we look at 3 evaluation criteria. We look at the overhead introduced by cryptographic operations of our solutions. We look at the anonymity set provided for the riders and the bandwidth requirements for the drivers. We also look at the effect of the equivalent distance on the ride matching optimality. So in this talk, I'm going to give you the result of the first 2 evaluation criteria, and for the third one, you can read that in the paper. So our implementation features Oblivious Ride matching algorithm, and in order to provide more than 112 bits of security, we use a modulus polynomial of degree 4096, and the size of the coefficients for the polynomials in the plain text, in the ciphertext is 124 bits, and that for the plain text is 20 bits. The implementation was done in C++ by using the NFL library, and we do not use optimization for the Intel processor. So the per ride overhead was measured on a laptop computer with the Intel processor. And so let's take a look at the bandwidth overhead for 2 settings, the naive approach and the optimized approach. And as you can see here, the optimized approach significantly reduced the bandwidth requirements for the rider. It reduced the bandwidth from the unpractical overhead of 700 megabytes to the negligible overhead of 200 kilobytes. And for the computation time for the riders, the drivers, and the service provider, you can see that the key generation operations and the decryption operation take less than 10 milliseconds, which is negligible. And again, here you can see that the optimization approach significantly reduced the computation time for the service provider from 100,000 milliseconds to 200 milliseconds. It also reduced the decryption time for the rider from almost 8,000 milliseconds to 2 milliseconds. So in this slide, I'm going to explain to you the trade-off between the anonymity set provided for the riders and the bandwidth requirements for the drivers. So why the trade-off? Because intuitively, the more requests coming from a zone, the larger the anonymity set for the rides coming out from that zone. But at the same time, it requires the drivers to respond to more requests, hence more bandwidth requirements for the drivers. So for this evaluation, we define the zones based on the nature of taxi demands in New York City. So the boroughs of Queens and Bronx are merged in a zone. Brooklyn and Staten Island are merged in a zone. For Manhattan, we define 2 levels of zone granularity. The center tract level, where each center tract is a zone, and the NTA level, where each neighborhood tabulation area is a zone. So first, let's take a look at the anonymity set provided by the solution. As you can see here, from the cumulative distribution function, for rides coming from for Manhattan with the zone granularity of neighborhood tabulation area, 80% of the rides will have an anonymity set of at least 1,000. And for rides coming from the zone consisting of queens and bronze, rides will have an anonymity set of more than 10,000, which is significant. I would like to note here that the size of the anonymity set can always be increased by expanding the size of the zone, and this will not negatively affect the accuracy of the ride matching algorithm, because in our algorithm, the distance between the rider and the driver is computed based on their precise locations. So let's take a look at the bandwidth requirements for the drivers. This is the uplink bandwidth requirements for the drivers, which is computed by multiplying the number of requests a driver receives per second with the size of the payload that he has to respond to the service provider. And as you can see from this cumulative distribution function, the required upload speed required for the driver is always smaller than 2 megabits per second, which is provided by 3 and 3.5G mobile network. This means that our solution guarantees large anonymity set for the riders, and it requires reasonable bandwidth for the drivers. So to conclude my presentation, I have presented to you ORide, a practical solution that matches the riders and the drivers in a privacy-preserving way, and it introduced only negligible overhead for the riders, the drivers, and the service provider. And we show that it guarantees strong privacy for the riders. And at the same time, we still offer key features of ride-hailing service, including accountability, easy payment, and reputation scores. And for more information about the project and the source code, you can go to oride.epfl.ch. And thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So one of the steps in your protocol is a direct secure channel between the driver and the rider. How is that secure channel made? Does it go through the service provider?
Yeah.
How does it set up?
It can just be an authenticated Diffie-Hellman protocol through the service provider, because we are going to verify the integrity of the secure channel later on when the rider and the driver have the short-range communication channel.
But the service provider then learns that this rider is talking to this driver right now, which is one of the things you were trying to protect.
But they are anonymous.
They use Tor to connect? How do you hide their...
So one of the assumptions that we make in the threat model is that the network layer doesn't leak information about the riders and the drivers. So so this can be...
But it does.
Well, because they use mobile networks, and so most of the mobile users, they don't have unique IP address. They are always behind a NAT. And in the extreme case, you can use like a VPN proxy or like Tor. But Tor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since we have a little bit of extra time, I know that you didn't put it in your presentation for timing reasons, but can you give us some idea of the effectiveness of the Euclidean distance? You were talking a little bit about how that was one of the metrics you had listed, and you said you were going to use it. Talk about it for time. Go back.
So which slide you want?
Yeah, go back about 5 slides.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
You mean the effect of the Euclidean distance?
Yes.
Yeah, so the matching based on the Euclidean distance performs reasonably well. I have the plot in the paper, but so for 80% of the cases, the extra waiting times for the rider is like 3 minutes, for like less than 3 minutes. And the distance, the extra driving distance for the drivers is less than half a kilometer. So, And we did the comparison between like the Euclidean distance matching and the driving distance provided by the Google APIs. And so that's the result,
So, I mean, the problem happens if there's a river between you
and the car. Yeah, that's a corner case. Or maybe it's just a one-way street, for example. Yeah, yes, those are the corner cases.
I know we probably don't want to spend time getting into the details of it as well, but I was also wondering a bit about whether or not the optimizations you had over the homomorphic encryption weakened any of the guarantees that you could make about what the provider was able to do or not do?
No, it doesn't weaken the security guarantees of the router system. Yeah.
Great. Let's go ahead and thank the speaker again.